Hello, everybody. My name is Sean Malden, and I'm the president of the University of Alberta Pride Alumni Chapter. The Pride Alumni Chapter is a volunteer-led group which seeks to provide opportunities for sexual and gender minority and allied alumni to meet, socialize, and support current students in LGBTQ2S+ programs and research on U of A campuses. We are proud sponsors of the Rainbow Visions Film Festival and are pleased to present our guest speakers to add context to our viewing of the Rainbow Visions films. I'm pleased to introduce Stephanie Booth, U of A alumna who received a Bachelor of Science at Augustana in 2014, then a Master's of Public Health in 2017. Stephanie is involved in a variety of LGBTQ2S+ health advocacy initiatives and works as an epidemiologist at the Public Health Agency of Canada. I'm also pleased to introduce Thomas Iglesias Trombetta, another U of A Augustana graduate who received their Bachelor of Arts in 2016 with a double major in Global and Development Studies and Sociology. Thomas is the community manager of Freddie, a health startup providing easy and inclusive HIV PrEP or pre-exposure prophylaxis care to the queer and trans communities. I'd like to welcome Stephanie and Thomas. Please take it away.
Hi, Thomas. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. I'm happy to be here with you tonight. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. So because we're here talking for Rainbow Visions Film Festival, I thought I'd start us off by asking you, what is an LGBTQ2S+ film or a film that had queer characters in it that has had an impact on you and the way you see yourself or the way you see the community?
That is, I love this question, but it is also very difficult because it has always been I've always been a huge fan of films. My mom and I used to go together and watch all of them before the Oscars. So it has always been kind of a tradition with me and my family. But one that definitely jumps out to me, also for some context, I'm an immigrant here, currently living in Calgary, but I'm from São Paulo, Brazil, and that's where I was born and raised. So one of the movies that struck a huge chord for me was one called The Way He Looks, or in Portuguese, Hoje Eu Quero Voltar Sozinho. That movie is about a gay blind boy in high school. And the reason why it struck such a chord is because I spoke very close to home for me. It really was the first time that I was seeing a context that resembled mine, like family and friends interactions that resembled mine, like from the language to the climate to the visuals, all of that was really beautifully done. So it was also a happy story at the end, which I really, really enjoyed. But like I said, there's so many to choose from. Currently, I'm watching actually a show called La Veneno, which is about a Spanish trans woman called Cristina Veneno, iconic. And it's just so beautifully done. Like every episode, waterfalls crying, just because of like the honesty and the beauty of the portrayal of, people understanding their gender and sexual identities in honest, complex, and human ways. So I think that those two, The Way He Looks as a movie and La Veneno as a show that I'm watching currently, are my favorites. But how about you? When you think about an iconic movie in your life, specifically speaking about queerness, transness, gender and sexual diversity, which one stands out and why?
So I thought about this and I wish I could give an answer about a movie that's like artistic or, like highly rated or actually about the LGBT community. But when I was thinking back like to formative films for me, the movie Across the Universe, which came out in the mid 2010s, which is sort of like a musical about Beatles music. It's not a queer film by any means, but early on, one of the characters is singing the song, I Want to Hold Your Hand. And it's subverted and you realize that the singer, who is a woman, is actually singing to another woman. And for me, watching that as a teenager and seeing something that was familiar to me, like Beatles music, and then subverted to queerness as I was figuring out my own sexuality, was really, really impactful. And also, I mean, I'm a musical theater queer, so the fact that there was music playing the whole time, I love that. So yeah, I think that that definitely was formative for me. And then as far as kind of current things I'm watching, I think this question has gotten almost harder to answer in the last 5 years because of streaming platforms and the access that people have to queer cinema. you know, it's not something that you can only find in queer movie stores anymore or in like specialty film festivals. It's so much broader than that now. We have so much more access to it.
100%. And to add on to that, like music, oh my God, such transformative power when it comes to kind of normalizing that, like music videos that I was growing up and kind of watching them. Just that simple decision of portraying like a same-sex couple, right, or a gender diverse person, as opposed to straight cisgender counterparts, like that to me was such a paramount, slowly building aspect of kind of normalizing queer identities for me. It was through watching, right? Whether it was videos, films, and to getting those references that like, hey, these are possibilities, you know, because otherwise you don't see them as possible bodies that exist happily or in complex ways.
Right. So speaking of that, we're talking about LGBTQ cinema and the diversity of it. What are some themes or topics that you think we need to look more critically at when we're talking about queer identity in film? Like, what are some things that stand out to you when we talk about LGBTQ films?
Yeah, I think that, like you said, there has been such a huge advent and increase in the access of those kind of media recently because of the advent of streaming platforms. Everybody has a phone nowadays. It is much easier and much less complicated to access that from the palm of your hand. So when I'm thinking around like, oh, what is paramount now? What do we need? I think kind of more stronger cultural nuances on queerness and transness are always going to be, because yes, we have made a lot of progress, but looking critically at that progress, it has largely been very North American, European centered, at least in the way that it has been represented. So having access to that history, not only traditional, but also ongoing history of, you know, queer and trans existence, struggles and strengths in different contexts outside of North America and Europe, outside of white contexts, I think is something that slowly but surely is coming to surface, and I'm very excited to see that being done more. And also more so about things that we're very uncomfortable talking about, which is sex work and transness. Those still, unfortunately, which sometimes are very connected, but become very taboo and are still very stigma when it comes to representation. So again, progress has been happening, but those are kind of the different nuances that I want to see a little bit more of. But how about you? Like, what do you think is imperative right now for us to be watching?
Yeah, similar to you. I mean, there's obviously a lack of diversity on who we're seeing, not only on screen, so actors, but also who is writing scripts, who is directing, and who is actually creating the stories and getting to choose the stories that are told. So as you said, we see people within our community who are still additionally marginalized, as you said, trans folks and people involved in sex work who we don't see as often. But I also think the types of stories that we're telling are something that I sort of find a gap in. I really want to see more stories about queer joy. You know, queerness is not, again, something that's a pathology. It's not something that is inherently sad, right? I want to see more queer joy in film and see that represented where it's not always, you know, a sad story, because it's certainly not being a queer person. I mean, we are some of the most joyful people that you'll ever meet. And as part of that as well, I want to see more, again, queer representation in films where the film topic isn't necessarily about queerness. Just the fact that people can be in films and the central conflict doesn't have to be about queerness. It can be about other things that everyone faces every day.
And to have like those representations and those voices as complex as we are, right? Because there's just an infinite ways for those expressions to take place, but a very limited representation of what actually those stories sound like. They're not all tragedy, like you said, but talking about the importance of, you know, breaking from that one story, one narrative. You know, Rainbow Visions has a wide array of narratives and a wide array of amazing films that I, for one, am very excited to learn more about and to watch. And I wanted to ask you, what are some of your faves? What are some movies that you peaked and you're like, I have to watch this one? What sparks your interest?
Yeah, well, it was hard for me not to just book off the whole week at work so I could watch all of the films being offered. But some that really stood out to me were The Novice, which is sort of a sports psychological dark thriller, which is about a queer young athlete who joins a rowing team. And I'm not really someone who I would say, is into sports movies, and I'm not someone who necessarily likes thrillers. But I think that the idea of queerness in sports, obviously with it being an Olympics year, that narrative is being talked about more and more, and especially as we see queer athletes come out in major leagues and major sport organizations. I think telling those stories is really important, and talking about as well the barriers that queer people face in actually accessing sports or accessing organized sports, professional sports. So that's something that's really interesting to me. And then another one I was really excited to see is called Small Town Pride, which is about a town in Nova Scotia and talking about how they celebrate Pride. I'm currently calling you right now from Yellowknife, and it's been interesting seeing the different ways that communities, especially remote or small communities, celebrate Pride and how they kind of define community and what that looks like. So I'd say those two stand out to me. But what about you? What are some ones that you had on your must-see list?
Yeah, and also for context for our audience, Steph and I both went to the Augustana campus in Camrose, and I think we're both lucky enough to see the growth of queer groups on campus, queer groups in the city, and the power that that really has in a small community that otherwise may not have access to LGBTQ2S+ based supports that bigger cities or centers may have. So again, support your local and smaller prides as much as you can. They're doing Lord's work. But in terms of Rainbow Visions films, there's also two that I kind of shortlisted for myself. One of them is P.S. Burn This Letter, Please. It's about letters from drag queens in the United States that were found decades after. And it just kind of gives a different glimpse on the reality lived by gender diverse people, trans people, drag performers. Often there was, those differentiations weren't really relevant, right, when it came to drag or existence. So as gender diverse people, right, it became a way of expression. A lot of those folks would identify as trans, a lot of those folks would identify as cross-dressers at the time. A lot of those folks would be gay men, you know, dressing up and performing. But it just kind of explores in an intergenerational context some of those differences and kind of how that existence happened and the ways people would protect, create community, find adversity, and then overcome that adversity, right, a lot of the time. So it is, I think, by watching the trailer, it made me tear up already. So I'm very excited. The other one, of course, because I do work in the field of HIV prevention and PrEP, I really want to watch the raw, uncut video, the take on the sexualized kind of content creation and porn, and kind of trying to break some of those barriers when it comes to sexual expectations, sexual norms, and sexual behavior in a time where there really also was not really highlighted and celebrated as much as today maybe. So that really drives my interest up. Also because porn is one of those topics that nowadays so many kids from such an early age are accessing sexual health information, right? Visuals and imagery from porn. So, you know, some level of porn literacy and education to me is always kind of lacking in some ways. So I'm always curious to see materials done about this.
It's so interesting that, you know, we've kind of talked about how queer cinema has allowed us more and more to see ourselves or see some of ourselves on film. But you and I both work in the healthcare field, and that accessibility is definitely not something that we see in healthcare services. So from someone like you who is boots on the ground, what are some ways that public health messaging, especially as you talked about on sexually transmitted bloodborne infections or safe sex, what are some ways that messaging can be more inclusive, or some creative ways to ensure that LGBTQ2S+ people see themselves in that messaging?
Oh, there's so many. There's so many interventions and things that we can do, mostly because that's largely untapped. As unfortunately, Canada hasn't really done a super phenomenal job in putting out provincial or federal public health information for STIs and HIV prevention, education, awareness, and campaigns against stigma. So there's a whole lot of work to be done. I think number one, we can talk about those things in a way that is gender and sexuality inclusive. We can talk about those things in an anti-stigma lens, in a way that discourages people from perceiving STIs as being inherently dirty or bad, because that doesn't make us want to talk about it. In a way that is creative, in a way that is fun. Like we're talking about sexual health, there's so much fun to be had and so much creativity. Plus just the simplicity of expressing, right, bodies as they are in the world, fat bodies, disabled bodies, racialized bodies, gender diverse bodies, all of those, you know, take space and exist. So anything that doesn't really represent that kind of goes beyond what I think we should be doing. So, you know, being more mindful of gender and sexuality, being more creative while still being evidence-based is really possible. But overall, investing more in creative ways to express that message. But how about you? What are your thoughts on like some missed opportunities when it comes to creative public health?
Well, first of all, I want to humble brag on your behalf. Thomas talked a lot about, you know, creativity and seeing a diversity of body and creative images. And Thomas, throughout all the different places you've worked over the years, I definitely see you bring that critical, creative eye to all the work that you do. And it makes me really excited that we have something like that in Alberta. So my perspective on creative health messaging is remembering at a public health level that queer health is bigger than just, of course, sexually transmitted infections and sexual health, but really encompasses things like mental health, community health, you know, emotional health, physical health, and bringing those creative aspects that we see on the cutting edge in sexual health and bringing those to other things as well. So when we're talking about, you know, access to physical health spaces in gyms, when we're talking about smoking cessation and those sorts of things, bringing those same principles across into these other topics, I think is really important because, you know, as we said, queer people have, you know, a diversity among themselves and a diversity of health issues that they might face. And I think we need to address that better and use some of the techniques that folks like you in the sexual health field have been, you know, doing for years and are continuing to do on the cutting edge.
So it's just like, to me, our message, I guess, if we had to sum it up, seems pretty kind of clear, right? Like we need to fight in all levels, whether it's in media representation, health messaging and understanding, STBBI education, the idea that our narratives and identities are singular or are monolithic, right? I think that, to me, overall, that's kind of how I see a lot of our little conversation, little chat today as representing, right? Like we need to have this specific and very tangible effort, which these movies really represent, into breaking from those monolithic stories, right? And show that, I like to quote a Brazilian artist that I really like, Linda Quebrada, and in one of her podcasts, she says that like everybody is a gender. Everybody is a sexuality. And understanding that for me is just has been like a paradigm of before and after of just like, yes, we're just as complex as each body is. So again, like breaking from that monolith to me seems like a very, you know, paramount and imperative thing for us to do when it comes to health and media.
So do you have any closing words that you'd like to say to the film goers of Rainbow Visions Film Festival about what they might expect or some things that they can do to critically assess kind of how they're consuming media?
I would say just always is the same kind of understanding that when I talk about data, right? When I talk about research, understand that as a single source, right? Understand that as what you're watching is one perspective, and that gives it, I think, the critical eye that you may need, but also some validity into understanding that there are other perspectives around there. And each perspective is very contextual, right? Most of the perspectives we've received historically have been white, straight, cisgendered, enabled bodies. So I think that trying to find sources of media and sources of information that go beyond that is right now what we should be doing, paying for it respectfully, and tipping your local drag performers. How about you?
That is very true. I think for me, I would just say to people who are watching these films to kind of take a step back and think about which films that you're inherently drawn to and why that might be, and which ones you kind of gloss over and don't think about. And then, I mean, have a question with yourself about which media are you consuming and why. So with that said, Thomas, I don't know about you, but I think I need to grab some popcorn because I have a lot of movies to watch.
I have a lot of movies as well. Again, I'm very excited, and I want to thank everybody putting together these events, Rainbow Vision, the Pride Alumni Chapter, you, Steph, for having this wonderful conversation with me, everyone involved who's here making culture, movies, specifically queer and trans-centered, and specific movies more accessible to the public. So continue to support those. Thank you for having us.
Thanks. All right, back to you, Sean. We will see you at the movies.
Wow, Stephanie Thomas, thank you so much. On behalf of the Pride Alumni Chapter, I'd like to thank you for this excellent conversation, excellent and informative conversation, which we present in conjunction with the Rainbow Visions Film Festival. And to our audience, we hope you enjoy all of the Rainbow Visions Film Festival films and experience that queer joy in the diverse narratives of the films that Stephanie and Thomas spoke so eloquently about. I'm going to be watching every single film, I know that. So please also look for the U of A Pride Alumni Chapter on Facebook to keep informed of all of our events and activities. Thanks again and enjoy the festival.